The Mask of Zorro by James Luceno. Read by Christopher Cazenove. Side 1. Storm clouds had been building throughout the afternoon, casting gloom on an already dark day. But neither the hulking thunderheads nor the threat of deluge were enough to keep the people of El Nuestra Senora de Reina de Los Angeles from gathering in the plaza to vent their rage over the pending execution of 3 of their own. By inviting death into the pueblo on the very eve of his departure, Comandante Rafael Montero was adding insult to injury. "Liberty! Equality! Independence!" the crowd chanted, taking up the rallying cry of independent Mexico. Alejandro and Joaquin Murrieta, only 8 and 10 years old respectively, crouched in the darkness of a canvas-covered wagon that sat in one corner of the plaza. "Hurry, Alejandro! Cut it before we're too late to see anything!" Alejandro punched his crude knife through the wagon's cover and pressed his left eye to the hole he had fashioned. "Hurry, Habarno!" Joaquin repeated. "Cut another hole!" As they watched, an older boy named Pepe tore from the crowd and began to shinny up the plaza's flagpole where a tattered Spanish flag snapped in the wind. A stout corporal broke ranks to restrain him, only to be forced back by the pressing throng, undaunted by the corporal's flintlock. A cheer went up as a second person dashed for the flagpole, and the green, white, and red flag of Mexico was unfurled and raised. Alejandro wondered if the cheering was any consolation to the 3 condemned men who stood blindfolded and bound to posts. He glanced worriedly at his brother. "He had better come soon, or else—" "Caramba! What's taken hold of you two, cutting holes in my wagon cover?" Senor Lopez, the pueblo's undertaker, stood like the reaper himself, shaking a scythe-like finger at the damage Alejandro's knife had done. "We're sorry, senor," Joaquin was quick to say. "We were only hoping to get a look at Zorro." "Mind your tongue, Chico, especially here, under the very gaze of the Comandante." "But he'll come, won't he? The fox will rescue them, no?" The undertaker paused for a moment, then said, "Hurry back to the mission. There's nothing for you to see here." Rafael Montero decided that the time had come to put in an appearance on the balcony of his Casa Mayor. Activity swirled about him on all sides, as servants and Indian slaves rolled up tapestries and rugs and packed the last of the household items into huge chests and shipping crates. The brigantine that was to carry Montero around the Horn and on to Spain would set sail the following morning, and several wagons full of his personal belongings had yet to be delivered to the beach at San Pedro. "Take special care of the cellar stock. For every bottle of wine I lose, the skin of your back will suffer tenfold." Montero gave a downward tug to his fine waistcoat, walked to the balcony, and stepped into full view of the crowd. "Death to Montero!" someone in the crowd shouted. "Death to Montero!" Pieces of rotten fruit spattered against the shutters to either side of him. Spain had begrudgingly slipped the yoke from Mexico's neck a year earlier, in August of 1821, but the news had only recently been received in California. Now the fledgling republic was in the hands of El Libertador, Agustin de Iturbide, along with those of an aristocratic upstart by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. "Your aim is as hopeless as your future," muttered Montero. "When Iturbide leaves you to rot on the vine like California's grapes, you'll pray that I was still in command, taxes or no." Near the edge of the crowd, Alejandro and Joaquin found their path blocked by Father Felipe, who was on his way to administer a final blessing to the condemned. He advanced on them like an angered bull. "Get back to the mission, you little cow chips! This is no place for children." He reached out, as if to take them both by the scruff of the neck, But the boys were too quick for him, and in a blink they had squirmed back into the forest of legs, just as 3 horsemen thundered into the plaza. Alejandro recognized one of the riders as Don Luis Ortiz, patron of the most wealthy cattle ranch in all of Los Angeles. With him rode his foreman and another vaquero. The 3 reined up in front of Montero's Casa Mayor, just below the balcony on which the seemingly bemused Comandante stood. Don Luis placed his hands on the silver pommel of his tooled saddle, dismounted in a rush, and hurried into the grand house. Montero glanced over his shoulder as Don Luis hastened through the parlor toward him, red-faced and out of breath. "Your Excellency, I just learned of the executions. You've no time for this. Soldiers from Santa Anna's army are even now on their way north from San Diego." Montero turned and held up his hands, no more ruffled by the news than by the jeering of the peons below. "Compose yourself, Don Luis. Take deep breaths." Don Luis blinked in confusion. Yes, but you must leave now." Montero faced the plaza once more. "Only one final duty to perform for the crown, as well as for myself." Don Luis stepped out onto the balcony. "Be sensible, Rafael. Why trouble yourself with tax evaders?" "These 3 are insurgents, and I won't tolerate insurrection." "Mexico may one day thrive without Spain," Don Luis remarked, "but Alta California will never be the same without you." Montero smiled faintly, and from inside his waistcoat he drew a sheet of impressed parchment, which he handed to Luis. "In compensation for your years of devoted service." "A land grant? But these are the property of the crown." "And by tomorrow they will be the property of the Mexican government, unless I turn them over to you." He placed his hands on Luis's shoulders. "Was not this land named after de Montalvo's imagined treasure island? Rest assured, my friend, California is richer than anyone knows, and upon my return, I will show you just how rich." Alejandro fought a losing battle against the friar who was hustling him from the plaza. "But someone has to prevent the killings, Father." "Don't worry yourself, young one. Someone will." Alejandro cast his eyes to the ground dejectedly. As he did, he noticed that the friar wasn't wearing his usual sandals, but black leather boots and silver spurs. Moreover, the tip of a scabbard showed where black silk trousers disappeared into the left boot. Alejandro lifted his gaze to the friar's face, which, though somewhat concealed in the darkness of his brown cowl, wore a black mask across wide-set eyes and an aquiline nose. Alejandro's heart hammered in his chest. "But you're—" Zorro shushed him. "That's to be our secret, no?" "Preparen!" the officer ordered. 6 troops cocked the hammers of their muskets, and the 3 prisoners straightened at their posts. "Apunten!" The soldiers raised the muskets to their shoulders and took aim. "Fuego!" With a loud crack, the braided tail of a black leather whip coiled itself around one of the guns. The wielder of the whip gave a sideways pull that yanked the musket into the one adjacent to it, which in turn slammed into the next gun in line, and so on. "El Zorro!" someone in the crowd yelled. "Viva El Zorro!" Steel met steel as Zorro's blade deflected bayonet lunges on all sides. Nimble as the fox that was his namesake, he countered each thrust with parries and counter-riposts that instantly sent 2 of the soldiers flailing back with hands clasped to their wounds. Zorro winced as he sustained a substantial gash in the arm. Then, disengaging, he vanished into a building, while soldiers shouldered through the crowd in mad pursuit. Having sneaked out to a nearby rooftop, Alejandro and Joaquin were waiting for Zorro to reappear when hands sheathed in black leather dropped down on their shoulders. Twisting in their grip, the boys found themselves staring at the fox himself. "My thanks to you, compañeros." Then he removed a medallion that hung from his neck and handed it to Joaquin. And with that, he turned and calmly stepped off the roof. "You should have known that Zorro would interfere," said Don Luis. He'll be a thorn in your side until the end. As he has been for 12 years, Montero thought. You underestimate me, Luis. I was counting on his showing up. What better way to coax the fox from his lair than by threatening to kill 3 members of his brood? Returning to the balcony, Montero caught a wisp of movement from the corner of his eye and turned in time to see a black shadow alight on the very balcony on which he was standing. Zorro's blade switched through a lightning-quick zigzag movement, and Montero grimaced in pain. 3 men, 3 cats, a small keepsake of Los Angeles, Raphael, to remind you never to return. The masked man whistled, and an imposing black stallion appeared through the crowd. With a touch of gloved fingers to the broad brim of his hat, Zorro sprang from the ledge onto Tornado's saddled back. Overwhelming the soldiers, the townspeople spilled across the plaza to cheer on their champion. Montero staggered to the balcony railing in time to see horse and rider disappear from view. Taking his hand from his slashed neck, he found on his palm, emblazoned in blood, the mirror image of the letter Z. Montero cursed and shook his fist to the heavens, vowing revenge on his nemesis, the masked man who had been the scourge of his existence. Zorro surmised that he wouldn't be pursued, not with Santa Anna's soldiers on the approach. But he took all the usual precautions nonetheless, tarrying in a copse of willow short of the bridge that spanned the Rio de Los Angeles, doubling back on his own trail. It had occurred to him that his years as the Dark Angel of Alta California, the defender of justice, had finally come to an end. Rafael Montero would be leaving, and with him would go the host of injustices he had perpetrated. The fox would pass into history, or better yet, into legend where he truly belonged, and Diego de la Vega would have his life back at last. Shortly, the de la Vega hacienda came into view, but Tornado moved instead toward a 30-meter-high waterfall that plunged some distance from the elegant house. The curtain of thundering water concealed the entrance to a giant cavern Diego had discovered quite by accident as a youth. Early on, the cave had been little more than a setting for imaginative boyhood games, but it had gradually become a place he sought out in times of confusion or reflection. Ridding himself of hat, mask, and cloak, Diego cleaned his rapier and placed it in a rack that held similar short swords along with several epées and a broad saber. He then changed out of his silken costume and continued to the rear of the shadowy grotto where he had built a small shrine to the Virgin. The prayer was a ritual he never failed to perform, though one he had long been eager to surrender. It was upon his return from university schooling in Madrid that he had first donned the fabled mask of Zorro. Indians had been persecuted and killed. Vaqueros and peasants had been brutalized and forced to pay exorbitant taxes. The arrest of his father, Alejandro de la Vega, who had himself served a term as governor for striking Montero, had firmed Diego's resolve to undermine, if not topple, the commandant. His prayer completed, Diego ascended the stairs that led to the hacienda and triggered the spring and pulley mechanism that swung open a slate door. The parlor was deserted. Diego quietly crossed the room to a doorway in the opposite wall and peeked in. Elena, just 2 years old, was asleep in her crib, under the watchful gaze of Mourning Dove, the child's devoted nursemaid. Diego swung around to a sound in the doorway and found Esperanza gazing at him as he had gazed on Elena a moment earlier. She looked radiant in the soft glow of the lanterns, but even in that romantic light, Diego could see that the long wait for his return had tormented her. "I was waiting on the veranda. I thought I'd see you ride up." Laughing affectionately, Esperanza came to him, kissing him and encircling his waist with her arm. Together they watched their little child, who stirred and smiled in her sleep. Diego gave her hand a gentle squeeze and led her back into the parlor and a short way down the hallway toward the staircase to the ground floor. As she moved to embrace him, Esperanza leaned against Diego's wounded arm and he flinched away. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. "Nothing, a scratch." He pressed his finger to her lips. Montero is returning to Spain, querida. Tonight was Zorro's final ride. You said such things before. This time is different. Her almond eyes shone brilliantly as she looked up into his face. Tell me more, husband. Why, we'll raise the finest cattle in Alta California. We'll host rodeos and wild fandangos, and all Californios will be desperate to attend. Will you dance? We will dance, my love, like never before. Diego, she sighed, smiling and pressing herself to him. He tilted her face to his and kissed her passionately, his heart bursting with a new sense of hope and relief. Only when she suddenly stiffened in his embrace did he open his eyes, reacting to her sudden disquiet as if to something she had glimpsed over his shoulder. Whirling like a dervish, Diego came face to face with Rafael Montero. Backed by two of his troops, Montero smiled cloyingly as he watched Esperanza and Diego from the staircase. On meeting their gaze, he felt certain that Esperanza, out of modesty, would back out of her husband's embrace. True to her defiant nature, however, she made a point of kissing him again, holding him more tightly than before. And where, earlier, rotten fruit or the tip of Zorro's rapier hadn't been enough to make Montero flinch, he did so now. Donna Esperanza, he said at last, looking as beautiful as ever. Before locking eyes with Montero, Diego's gaze fell briefly on the bandage he had plastered over the Z that had been slashed into the flesh of his neck. What brings you here, Don Rafael? Esperanza asked nervously. Fate, he replied. Diego affected an arrogant smile. What an honor to have the former governor of Los Angeles in our home. Won't you stay for supper? There was a time, Montero said almost casually, when yours were not the only arms that embraced such loveliness. Or perhaps Donna Esperanza failed to tell you of the moments we shared while you were perfecting your manners in Madrid. Diego managed to keep an even tone in his voice. On the contrary, she has spoken not only of those moments, but of other misfortunes as well. Montero sniffed. Infantile wit was undoubtedly a close second to your studies in manners, Don Diego. Or was it third, after swordsmanship? Seize him! Montero advanced a step and placed a hand on Diego's wounded arm, then tightened his grip. Blood oozed through the fabric of his sleeve. Blood never lies, Zorro. Take him away. Diego stiffened, drew himself up to his considerable height, and threw the guards off. He at once relieved the nearest one of his saber and lunged at Montero. As the two men began to circle each other, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight, a fierce, silent understanding passed between them. The customary rules of engagement no longer applied. This was to be a duel to the death. Montero rushed Diego, engaging him with bold cross-strokes and furious thrusts. Diego executed counterattacks and grazing actions with dazzling dexterity. He contrived his parries and ripostes until he suddenly took hold of Montero's sword arm and sent it smashing backwards into the wall. At the same time, his own blade rose to meet Montero's throat. Hammers cocked. Desperate to intercede, Esperanza rushed forward just as the loud report of a musket sounded. Both Montero and Diego turned to see Esperanza stumble and collapse, a red blemish blossoming on the bodice of her silk gown. No, Diego uttered. No! His back still pressed to the wall, Montero slowly lowered himself and took up the sword. Then, descending a few steps, he plunged it straight into the heart of the troop who held the smoking gun. I am sorry. I would never have let any harm come to her. Diego's eyes were animated by a cold fury when he looked up. She was never yours to protect. He might have said more, but Montero swung the saber's handguard into the back of his head, and Diego fell to the floor. The world faded in and out of focus as Diego struggled to climb from the black pit of unconsciousness. He soon grasped that he was trapped in an iron cage set atop a rickety carreta, an ox cart. The fire, brightening the raven night, was his house, engulfed in flames. "Elena!" he shouted. "Elena!" He pulled himself upright and watched as his arch-enemy approached the cage, his face black with smoke, a bloody bandage dangling from his neck. "Montero, give her to me! Let me hold her!" Montero stopped just out of reach, rocking Elena in his arms and comforting her with gentle pats on the back. "Ah, it's true what they say. You do have your mother's eyes." Diego gripped the rusty bars and shook the cage. "You can't imprison me! You haven't the authority!" "Who said anything about authority? This is just between the two of us. Where you're going, there'll be no one to set you free." Diego raised his gaze to the smoke-filled sky. "Damn you to hell, Montero!" "As I have you, de la Vega." As he turned and walked away, lightning flashed over the ocean, thunder rolled across the vast landscape, and the first heavy drops of rain spattered on the thirsty ground. One of the soldiers leaned toward the cage. "No man survives the dungeon at Talamantes, not even Zorro." Turning to the wagon driver, he added, "Away with him!" A lash sounded. The wagon jerked into motion and began to roll steadily through the driving storm. Throughout the 1830s, while De Iturbide and Santa Anna grappled with making the most of Mexico's hard-won independence, Alta California remained a remote land. Once he became president, Santa Anna extended Alta California's northern frontier, but he reneged on his promise to turn mission land over to the Indians. Instead, he awarded huge tracts of ranch and grazing land to aristocrats and military officers who had won his favor. Rafael Montero had monitored Santa Anna's actions from afar. It was rumored that somewhere along the way Montero had taken a wife who had died shortly after, bearing him a beautiful, spirited daughter. It was also rumored that Montero had become friendly with Santa Anna himself and that he had accepted a commission in the Mexican army. Don Diego de la Vega was widely believed to have died in the hacienda fire that also claimed the lives of his wife and infant daughter. As for Zorro, he seemed to have simply disappeared into the night from which he had been born. "You should be out apprehending desperados instead of helping yourselves to my meager wares." The owner of the general store was as slender as Cadet Corporal Lopez was rotund. Lopez's quick, ravenous bites made short work of the peach, nevertheless. "You should be honored to have a soldier of my rank steal your fruit, viejo." He wiped his ample mouth with the back of his hand, laughed, and grabbed another peach before the old man could stop him. The dilapidated store was situated alongside a water station on a secondary road that ran between Los Angeles and San Pedro Harbor. "Bandits prowl the territory, and all you do is graze like cattle," the proprietor muttered. His crooked finger indicated a sepia reward poster nailed to the store's front wall. "These two? Why aren't you off chasing these two?" A printed legend below the drawings read, "Joaquin and Alejandro Murrieta." Lopez was about to comment when a young boy skulked from the store as if fearful of a beating. "What's wrong with him?" "He comes from a family of fishermen who lived near San Pedro, but they disappeared some weeks ago." "More people disappear every day. Ranchers, farmers, Indians. President Santa Anna sent you here to watch over us, and this is how you behave to your own people. Alta California is worse now than it was under the Spanish crown. Then at least the oppressed had Zorro to call on." Lopez sniggered. "Zorro? Even if he did exist, he'd be no match for me." "Corporal Lopez!" one of the soldiers shouted. "Strangers!" Lopez followed the troop's finger to the road, where a man on horseback seemed to materialize out of the ambient dust and afternoon glare. Behind him shuffled two more men, yoked to each other and to the horse by a thick rope. "Hey, hey, come one, come all," he was calling out to Lopez and the others. "Come have the fright of your lives. See the notorious Murrieta brothers." Dismounting, Jack the bounty hunter asked to have a look at the wanted poster. His left hand sported only 3 fingers, and around one of his false fingers was an elaborate turquoise ring. "These men are now in the custody of the military," Lopez announced. "You can claim your bounty at the Cuartel General." "Don't accept it, Jack," Alejandro Murrieta said. "You can probably get more for us in Monterey or Santa Barbara." Lopez took a menacing step forward and slapped Alejandro hard across the face. "Shut up!" But no sooner had the words left his mouth than Joaquin drew a pistol. "Touch my brother again and you die here and now." Lopez's eyes darted. Then, with surprising agility, he flung himself to one side, shouting, "Take them!" Alejandro dropped to his knees as the 2 soldiers rushed forward. Tensed, the rope provided a neat snag for the soldiers, who struck it face first and fell to the ground. The 3rd soldier lunged with his bayonet, but Joaquin succeeded in yanking the musket from his grip. Swinging it like a club, he caught the soldier on the side of his face, dropping him. Lopez, meanwhile, found himself staring down the barrel of 3-fingered Jack's sawn-off Bess. "You know what chafes me most about this poster? More than the measly 200 pesos. That it don't even mention me." Without warning, he grabbed Lopez by the lapels of his jacket. "I'm the holy guts of this gang. You understand? Without 3-fingered Jack, the whole damn opera falls apart." The 3 bandits hadn't gone more than 3 leagues in the stolen wagon when the ocean came into view and the road began to twist down through hedgehog cactus and coastal sage toward San Pedro Harbor. Joaquin was driving, and Alejandro rode in the back with the strongbox. "So what are you planning to do with your share of the loot?" Joaquin didn't have to think about it. "Buy myself a saddle with a silver pommel. People will see me and say, 'Now there rides a wealthy caballero.' What about you?" "I've been thinking of heading up onto Monterey or Yerba Buena for a spell and buy myself a beautiful woman." "Better love than a fancy saddle or a couple of drunk nights in Monterey." Alejandro now turned his attention to the locked strongbox. He trained the business end of the gun on the lock and blew it open, the report of the shot echoing in the coastal hills. Lifting the lid, he expected to find leather pouches of gold and silver coins, but in fact the box contained nothing more than a single rat, rightfully panicked and probably deaf from the rifle round. "We've been set up." Alejandro saw 6 mounted soldiers spanning the road some distance ahead. A glance back at the way they had come revealed 6 others positioned on the ridgeline. In the confusion, the report of a pistol rang out, and Alejandro saw Jack, bleeding from his right thigh, sprawled below a blonde, mounted soldier in the buttoned navy uniform of a cavalry officer. A Yankee, by the look of him, with a Patterson Navy Colt revolver aimed more or less at Jack's heart. Alejandro hadn't gone 50 meters when he heard a second shot. Turning, he saw Joaquin on the ground, holding his leg, and the Yankee calmly lowering a rifle from his shoulder. "It is useless, Alejandro," Joaquin protested. "Leave me. Vayate, now." Alejandro recognized it as more of a plea than a threat. "I'll find a way to free you, brother." He dug the toes of his boots into the sandy soil and sprinted for the cover of the stunted brush. Seated imperially on his mount, Harrison Love ordered one of the lancers to gag and hog-tie 3-fingered Jack. "What do you want with me?" Joaquin asked Love. Love smoothed the ends of his thick mustache. "I consider it a genuine honor to arrest you in the name of the Mexican government." "Arrest me? You're a damn Yankee. And you're the bandit, Joaquin Murrieta." "I am no bandit. The name is a common one throughout Alta California. and you have me confused with someone else. Love tapped the saber against his leg. Prop him up! One of the lancers dismounted and forced Murietta into a sitting position. Raising his sword, Love swung it through a swift arc, decapitating Murietta with one stroke. Find the brother, he ordered, and somebody sling three-fingered Jack over a horse. And this one? Love slid the saber into its scabbard. Bury the body, but bag the head, for identification purposes. Alejandro ground his teeth to keep from screaming and revealing his whereabouts. The lancers were being half-hearted in their search. If any of them had been trackers, they would have already discovered him. By dusk, the soldiers had given up the search, and Alejandro retraced his steps to where he and Joaquin had separated. There, a small pool of blood, black in the moonlight, had yet to be absorbed by the soil. He was crossing himself when his gaze was drawn to a gleaming in the moonlight among the small stones nearby. On hands and knees he advanced towards the source of the reflection, and in a moment he had plucked Joaquin's medallion from the ground, the one Zorro had given him 20 years earlier. The feel of it was enough to wrench an anguished moan from deep within him. Clenching his hand around the engraved circle, he hunched over Joaquin's grave and gave loud voice to the grief bottled inside him. Side 2. Anchored off the coast, just south of Santa Barbara, the brigantine Ayacucho rocked in the waves of the moonlit Pacific. From her portside rail, Rafael Montero gazed at the dark land, marveling at the fact that 2 decades had passed since he had last set eyes on California. Don Montero, the quarterboat is ready, the brig's captain was saying. But I feel obliged to caution you once more about undertaking such a landing at night. These waters can be treacherous at this time of year, even for the best of my hands. Your concern for my safety is most appreciated, Captain, but there is something I need to attend to this evening, while there's still time. Later, as Montero was being helped from the boat, a dark figure approached from the shadows. Welcome back to California, Don Montero. Montero shook the prophet's hand. Good to see you again, Captain Love. It appears that California has not been unkind to you. Kinder than Mexico City was, sir. Of course. Montero instructed the 4 sailors to await his return, then he mounted the spare horse. Talamante's prison lay only 2 hours away by a recently blazed trail that followed the coast. Love and Montero hitched their horses to a rail at the gated entrance and demanded that they be escorted to the warden's quarters immediately. A rank-smelling corridor ended at a tiny room on the ground floor, indistinguishable from the holding cells that surrounded it, save that it lacked a door of iron bars, or indeed a door of any sort. The guard's lantern spilled scant light across the spread-eagled body of a slovenly man of indeterminate years. Love took hold of a wash basin and hurled its filthy contents into the face of the supine, snoring figure. Surfacing from demon-plagued slumber, the warden bolted upright, flailing his arms about. Gradually his blinking eyes focused on Love, then Montero. Don Montero, is it truly you, or am I seeing a ghost? A thin smile spread across Montero's face. It's me in the flesh, Sergeant Romero. I've come to call on one of your prisoners. His name is Diego de la Vega. He was brought here 20 years ago. 20 years? Ah, but he must surely have died by now, senor. Montero shook his head. Not de la Vega. He had good reason to go on living. Lantern in hand, Romero escorted Montero through the prison's reeking corridors, while a guard named Ordaz brought up the rear. Unlocking a door at the bottom of the staircase, he waved them into a narrow passageway, on which opened 2 long rows of iron-barred cells. 2 lines of shackled, emaciated prisoners stood slouching outside their cells. Ordaz and the guards positioned themselves at intervals along the corridor, clubs in hand. Transfixed, Montero stared at the prisoners and then began to walk slowly down the line. If the one once called Zorro is here, stand forth and show yourself. Otherwise, things will be unpleasant for all of you. The prisoners seemed to tremble en masse. Then, after a long moment, a feeble voice cried, I am the fox. Startled, Montero swung away from the old man who had spoken. His eyes settled on a tall, muscular black man. I am the man you are looking for. I am Zorro. Lies! More lies! Said another voice. I am the one. I am Zorro's sister, announced another. Shortly, almost everyone in the dungeon was either claiming to be Zorro or arguing with the others who had. The stench of the place became asphyxiating. Even De La Vega couldn't have survived 20 years of it, Montero assured himself. He had to be dead. Diego resignedly accepted the hard shove that sent him stumbling back into his cell. He hadn't recognized Montero until the proclamations of Zorro, Zorro had summoned him from the sheltering stupor he had fallen into over the years. Ordaz hurled one they called the skeleton into an adjacent cell with such viciousness that the old man crashed against the rough-cut stones of the rear wall and crumpled to the ground. He stood over the skeleton for a moment. One for the cemetery. Fetch someone to get him out of here before his stink overpowers the stench of the rest of them. Marshalling his thoughts, Diego waited until the guard had exited. Then, thrusting his arms through the bars, he locked his hands around Ordaz's throat. He smashed his head once, twice, 3 times against the rusted bars until Ordaz slumped to the floor, unconscious or dead. Then Diego stretched out and took hold of the ring of keys and dagger that Ordaz wore on his belt. Unlocking his cell door, he dragged the guard inside. For the first several years of his imprisonment, Diego had kept his sanity by imagining the vengeance he would ultimately exact on Montero. The interminable days of dark, dank confinement would find him lost in extended fantasies in which he escaped Talamantes, picked up Montero's trail, and tracked him clear around the world, from California to Acapulco, and on to Lima, then around Cape Horn to ports of call in Brazil and the Canaries. In these reveries, Elena always remained the child Montero had carried from the burning house, and when, after some time, Diego finally allowed himself to think of her as a young girl, then an adolescent, he would see Esperanza. And now he was meant to have his freedom, fittingly by exiting as one of the dead. Diego staggered into the skeleton cell and dragged the corpse of the old man into his own cell. Then he took the skeleton's place on the floor. Lying as still as death, he allowed the guards to manhandle him into the sack. Diego felt himself lifted and carried through the door and up the winding stairway, then into the cool air of an evening that had never smelled so sweet and fragrant. But he managed to suppress his joyous sobs and retreat to that familiar place within himself as he was laid into the earth and dirt was shoveled onto him. Diego waited until he was confident that the guards had returned to the prison. Then he drew the dagger and ripped a large opening in the bag. He angled his body up as the dirt fell into his eyes and ears, emerging at last into moonlight as if from a cocoon, gasping for air like a newborn. And almost at once the timeless reveries about Montero began to fill his mind. Now he wasn't even going to have to chase him halfway around the world. Swords glittered and clashed in the scant light that filtered into the cargo spaces of the Ayacucho, anchored in 11 fathoms 3 miles out from San Pedro. Armed with rapiers, a grizzled but spry old salt named Lafarge and a long-haired youth circled one another warily. A feint, then a lunge, and Lafarge's sword was flung aside. The tip of the other sword was poised directly at his heart. Elena Montero, dressed in men's trousers and a ruffle shirt, tipped her blade forward in salute. "Elena!" someone shouted. Her dark eyes widened. "Father!" Tossing her rapier to Lafarge, she scooped up her traveling cape. Elena found Montero on the main deck and slipped her arm through his. "All my life I've dreamt of coming to Los Angeles, and now that we're here, it still feels like a dream." Montero squinted at the shore. "Lend me your telescope if you would, Captain." Montero pointed the brass device at the beach, focused it, then handed it to Elena. "You see, daughter? Scarcely a dream." Montero stepped from the beached longboat and extended a helping hand to Elena. Louis hurried down the beach to meet them. "Welcome back, Raphael. It's been too long." Montero embraced his friend warmly, then stood back to appraise him. "Some gray in the beard, a few lines in the face, but otherwise unchanged all these years." 20 years ago I was a foolish man." He slipped a small pouch into Montero's hand. "Consider this an apology for my having ever doubted you." Opening the pouch, Montero found a nugget of gold half the size of his fist. Louis clapped him heartily on the back. "Come, Raphael, your admirers await you." "Enough flattery. They have little reason to respect me." He turned to the assembled peons. "Let me say this to you. False hope and broken promises are all any of you have had since I left California. Hope once offered by a bandit who hid his face behind a black mask and later deserted you, and empty promises from a womanizing aristocrat who will soon proclaim himself dictator of Mexico. I say that the time has come to take destiny into your own hands, not as Spaniards, not as Mexicans, but as Californians." Few in the crowd knew what to make of Montero's remarks. 20 years ago I left you to the care of Mexico," Montero went on. "But now I offer you this solemn pledge to help you fight for a free and independent California." Some among the crowd were applauding, though not everyone was convinced. Father Felipe asked, "And what is Santa Anna likely to make of your talk of independence, Don Montero?" "I assure you, good padre, that Santa Anna is too busy with alleged affairs of state to concern himself with California." Father Felipe was not impressed. "I, for one, remember well your notion of freedom from oppression, Don Montero." Montero made no secret of his ruefulness. "Ah, but I've changed, Father. I've changed." Diego, dressed now in peasant garb he had stolen from a closed washing spot along the river, had been making his way, meter by meter, toward the front of the crowd. He was now prisoner of a single overriding obsession: to kill Rafael Montero. He had yet to find the opening he needed, but his desperation had reached such a fevered pitch that he was ready to throw himself from the crowd like an assassin. "Father!" Both Diego and Montero turned to the voice. It belonged to a woman, perhaps 20 years old, tall and striking to behold, with long raven hair and eyes that gleamed brighter than the blade of Diego's knife. Elena. Almost swooning, Diego watched her approach, walking straight towards him. Unbearably, she went instead into the waiting arms of Rafael Montero. Diego let the dagger slip from his hand. He saw suddenly that killing Montero was not going to be as simple as he had imagined. The man he had come to loathe was the man Elena had come to adore, and to kill him would be to deprive her of the only family she knew. Diego turned and disappeared into the crowd. The sole customer in a dingy pulqueria on the Los Angeles Pueblo Plaza, Alejandro banged his glass on the table and called for a refill. 3 days had passed since the encounter with Harrison Love and the Lancers, and Alejandro was determined to be blind drunk before sunrise. "Another mezcal, or whatever this stuff really is." The owner wagged his head. "Cierto, amigo, but let's see some money first." Alejandro's hand closed on Joaquin's medallion. "Es a plata?" "Of course it's silver, the finest silver." He was reaching for the medallion when an aged hand closed tightly around the silver piece. Alejandro and the barkeeper turned to find a tall, wild-eyed old man standing over them. "What do you want here, viejo?" "Leave us," the old one said, in a quiet but firm manner that left little room for argument. "Where did you get this?" Alejandro threw the rest of the drink down in a single gulp and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "It belonged to my brother, my late brother." "You shouldn't trade something so precious for a mere glass of mezcal." Alejandro straightened in his chair as he saw the Texan, Harrison Love, ride into the plaza. Glaring and licking his lips, he came to his feet unsteadily. "Who is that man to you?" Alejandro shook off the old man's hand. "The one who murdered my brother." "You're in no condition to engage a professional soldier in sword play." "Out of my way," Alejandro warned. A quick glance at the plaza, however, revealed that Love was gone. The old man pressed the tip of his walking stick to Alejandro's chest. "Perhaps you would like to demonstrate your fencing skills on me." Alejandro's grief and frustration burst from him in a moment of uncontrolled fury. He raised his saber and lunged, only to find his blade deceived as the old man stepped nimbly to one side, spinning Alejandro around and sending him straight to the floor. "If you're intent on killing this man, I can train you to do so. The correct way to move, the correct way to think." Alejandro narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Why are you so eager to help me?" The old man hung the medallion around Alejandro's neck. "Because you and your brother once did the same for me." Alejandro studied the old man's face. "Is it possible that you are Zorro? We all thought you had disappeared or were dead." "I was." On the grounds of the palatial hacienda Montero had purchased years earlier, Harrison Love and another rider were competing in an obstacle race. From a safe distance, Montero was giving his attention to a long list of names Luis had handed him. "This banquet is of utmost importance. I want every landowner in California to attend." Against all expectation, Love's opponent had nearly edged into the lead, but it was still Harrison Love who was first to cross the finish line. "Well done, senorita, that a lady such as yourself can ride like the wind." He faltered and swallowed hard. Elena's smile broadened. "Why, thank you, Mr. Love. Or is it Captain Love?" Flustered, Love caught sight of Montero. "Your daughter's a very impressive rider, Don Montero." "I hired you to run my army, Captain, not to encourage my daughter to embarrass herself in public." Elena smiled, took Montero by the arm and began to lead him away. As they walked towards the hacienda, he turned to her. "You'll let him win, of course," Montero said conspiratorially. Her eyes brightened. "Of course I did." 10 paces into the mouth of the cave, Alejandro stopped and turned around to gaze incredulously at the waterfall. "Come," Diego said, gesturing with his torch. "There's more." Alejandro sucked in his breath as they entered the gigantic vaulted room at the rear of the cave. Even though the place was in shambles, it still retained its grandiose aura. He glanced around. "This is truly the place, the lair of the fox." He came to the stairs. "And where do these lead?" "They used to lead to the parlor of the De La Vega household." "Then you are—" Diego inclined his head. Diego de la Vega. But everyone thought you had died in the fire, with your wife and child. Where have you been all these years? I was dead. We'll leave it at that. Alejandro nodded. I've heard talk of Montero's return. It is said that he has grand plans for California's future. I recall something about Montero, that Zorro was his sworn enemy, as was Don Diego de la Vega. He must not know that I am here. Alejandro glanced to the stairs in sudden revelation. He was responsible for the fire. He did this to you. You are going to kill him, am I right? Diego evaded the question. First, I am going to learn something more about his grand designs for Alta California, and just how this Harrison Love from Texas fits into them. And then? Then, if you are properly prepared, we'll both tempt our fates. Alejandro grinned widely and took up his saber. Then let my training begin. Diego circled him slowly. Do you have the slightest notion how to employ that thing? Alejandro tracked him. Cierto. The sharp end goes in the other man. Diego blew out his breath. This may require more work than I thought. This is the training circle of the Spanish school, Diego explained from the outermost concentric circle of the now fully exposed marble dais. It was designed by the swordmasters Narvaez and Thibault. There is nothing outside of it. Until I tell you so, even Harrison Love does not exist. Revenge, Alejandro, can be a cruel master. Vengeance heightens the senses and inspires confidence, but ultimately it clouds your judgment and betrays your attack. Do you understand me? Alejandro nodded. Do you believe me? I believe you. Diego nodded curtly. Then we have made a beginning. He now began to explain the design of the training circle on the dais floor. As your skill improves, you will progress to a smaller circle. And with each new circle, your world contracts, bringing you that much closer to your adversary, that much closer to retribution. Alejandro hung on his words. This part I like. Diego ignored the enthusiasm and began to walk towards Alejandro, raising his sword. Alejandro took a breath and raised his sword. Show me a lunge. Alejandro complied, though awkwardly and slowly. Your stance is too wide. Move your front foot back a bit. Again, Alejandro complied. Turn your knee out. Out! Now, straighten up. I want a lunge, not a remise. You're gazing at me as you would a horse, Alejandro said out of the side of his mouth. Maybe you should check my teeth and gums and coat while you're at it. You think you're being humorous, but you're closer to the truth than you know. The alignment of your legs will prove to be as important as speed or accuracy. Dueling is balance, and if you fail to achieve it, you will fail at all that follows. Diego jabbed Alejandro with his forefinger, toppling him as if in slow motion from his lunge pose. The sword slipped from Alejandro's grasp and clattered onto the floor. Diego picked up the blade and tossed it to him. Don't hold it too loosely, but don't attempt to crush it either. Hold it the way you might hold a woman. Alejandro thought about it for a moment, then resignedly altered the position of his hand. A few days later, Alejandro found Diego standing by the small shrine he had built. But rather than lighting the candles or praying, he was placing the gold cross and the ivory statue of the Virgin into a burlap sack. We need supplies. I'll go to the pueblo and trade these trinkets for what we need. They mean nothing to me any longer. All that matters is your training. Alejandro leapt to his feet. I'm going along. Diego had the reins of the cart and Alejandro was slumped in the back, the bag of holy objects beside him. Suddenly, 3 soldiers galloped past, leading 5 obviously unbroken horses, 3 mustangs among them. That one's name is Lopez, whispered Alejandro. Look at the stallion he leads. It could be the child of your own tornado. Small, swift and hard, with a shiny jet-black coat, the Andalusian trotted proudly, even in captivity. As Diego and Alejandro watched, the horse suddenly reared back, pulling Lopez's mount up short and sending the cadet corporal himself completely out of his saddle. Diego's eyes remained on the Andalusian. "He's enough like Tornado to be his ghost," he muttered. In front of the cabildo, the black steed overturned a stall stocked with drapery. Seeing an opportunity, Alejandro was out of the ox cart and running directly in the path of the horse. It reared up as if to kick Alejandro with its forelegs, but instead came down on all fours and, unbelievably, allowed him to approach and stroke its mane. At the same time, an elderly man had emerged tentatively from his carriage and was offering Alejandro profuse thanks for having intervened. "I do believe you saved our lives, young man. I am Don Peralta of Capistrano." In a show of gratitude, the Don opened his purse, prized out a real, and flipped it Alejandro's way. The former horse thief accepted the meager reward by clasping the hand of his benefactor, although staggering clumsily against him as he did so. "That was brave but reckless," Diego remarked. "Even a wanted man who has trimmed his beard and washed the filth from his face should know better than to call attention to himself. Someone might have recognized you." "It was worth it." Alejandro thumb-tossed the silver coin to Diego. "Hardly." Grinning, Alejandro discreetly began to pull several new acquisitions from his pockets, a ring, a bracelet, a letter or invitation of some sort, all of which he placed in Diego's hands. "Maybe there are a few things I can teach you, Don Diego. Now you can hold on to those worthless objects of yours for a while longer." Alejandro lunged forward from the perimeter of the outermost circle, holding his position while Diego watched from the center of the marble dais, a black bullwhip in his hand. Without warning, the whip cracked, taking a button from Alejandro's shirt. "Again, you are too far forward." "You could simply have told me instead of ruining a perfectly good shirt." "Again," Diego ordered. Alejandro withdrew his lead foot and lunged, only to feel the whip against the shirt's blousy sleeve. Beads of perspiration broke on his forehead and upper lip, conjured by the mounting resentment as much as exertion. "If the shirt is not to your liking, then why not say so and be done with it?" he grated. Alejandro tried to refocus on his task, but it was difficult to suppress his memories of Joaquin, his dead brother. And even when he could put Joaquin from his thoughts, it would be Harrison Love who came to mind, frustrating all efforts to improve his mastery of the blade. "Your mind is elsewhere," Diego snapped. "Again and again I've cautioned you about thinking. In a duel to the death, you can't afford to have your technique suffer." "Words, words. All you do is talk of dueling. The way to gain mastery is to fight." Diego studied him carefully for a moment, then spun on his heels and stormed from the cavern. Alejandro fought down an urge to apologize. Instead, he reached into his pocket for the black scarf that he'd stolen the previous afternoon. An idea had suddenly come to him. The sun was setting by the time Alejandro reached the pueblo. With a black scarf masking his eyes, he bent over the watering trough there to gaze at his reflection, satisfied with the 2 eye holes he had cut in the silk. "Buenas noches, el Zorro," he said to the image in the water. "Where's the costume ball?" The question came from a young woman sitting Western style on a gelding. She wore a beautiful long ruffled cotton dress with a shawl, but her black hair was undone and windblown. "You should take care, senorita. There are dangerous men about." Her fine eyebrows arched mockingly. "Really? Should you see any, I trust you'll be sure to point them out to me." Alejandro moved stealthily towards the side of the church and quickly climbed to the roof, then leapt from the roof to the wall of the compound and from there to the roof of the stable. He let a minute pass, then righted himself and dropped to the floor. Gazing around, he spotted the black Andalusian in one of the stalls. "Ah, but you're a fine one," he whispered. "Take it from one who has stolen many a horse in his time." Planting a foot in the stirrup, he gingerly threw his leg over the saddle and sat perfectly still for a moment, holding his breath. Then he nudged the horse in the sides with his boot heels, and the animal went berserk. Alejandro managed to hang on, nevertheless, even after the horse kicked out 2 of the posts that supported the hayloft. The barracks door flew open on its strap hinges, and Lopez and several others rushed in. Front hooves flailing, the stallion reared up, finally tossing Alejandro to the floor. Soldiers closed in on him from all sides. Alejandro rolled, crawled, and somersaulted to avoid their clutching hands and stomping feet. The urgent acrobatics carried him into a weapons room. With nothing to lose for trying, Alejandro grabbed a torch from a wall sconce and touched it to the fuse of the breech of one of the cannons. He was dumbfounded when the weapon discharged, all but deafening him and leveling almost the entire front wall of the building. When Alejandro had recovered enough, he made a mad dash for the side entrance of the church. It was almost time for Vespers, but the only person in evidence was Father Felipe. Confronted by a masked figure in head-to-toe black, the padre stopped short and frantically crossed himself twice in rapid succession. "Dios mío, Santa Maria," he uttered. "Is this some vision, or have you actually returned?" Alejandro cleared his throat meaningfully. "Padre, quickly," he said. "I need sanctuary." Father Felipe grew almost giddy. "Of course you do, and believe me, my son, we need you now more than ever." Alejandro was already hastening for the only hiding place within sight, a tall, cloth-roofed confessional booth with two ornately carved doors. "Father, are you all right?" a female voice asked from the far side of the partition. Alejandro froze. He had no choice but to slide open the door that concealed a window of tightly woven wooden latticework. I have no concerns, my child." "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 3 days since my last confession." Alejandro risked leaning toward the partition in an attempt to identify who was doing the talking. When he did, he saw the large and lovely eyes of the young woman he had encountered at the hitching rail. "Please continue." "I've had impure thoughts regarding a certain man." "Recently?" "Just today, and I fear he might be a bandit." "Really?" "Black mask, husky voice, ruggedly handsome." "Yes, and when he looked at me, well, I mean, when I looked at him, Father, I felt as if I was on fire." Sudden commotion in the church told Alejandro that the soldiers had gained entrance. "This is a house of God," Father Felipe told them in loud protest. Harrison Love cut him off. "Search everywhere. The chapel, the loft, even the sacristy. He has to be somewhere." Alejandro leaned toward the partition a final time. "Señorita, trust your heart. It won't lead you astray. Now, go in peace." He closed the small door and waited for her to leave. As he was about to do the same, he heard Love speak to her from the other side of the confessional. "Señorita Montero, what are you doing here?" "I was merely confessing, Captain Love." "Confessing to whom, señorita, when Father Felipe is right here? Stand aside, if you please, señorita. There is a dangerous desperado on the loose." Alejandro didn't waste a moment. He was already scampering through the fabric ceiling and out into the loft when a hail of lead tore the confessional to pieces. Side 3. Alejandro made his way across the church loft and out onto the roof without any of the soldiers seeing him. Not too far away stood the black Andalusian, munching contentedly at scrub grass. "Tornado! Psst! Come here, boy!" The stallion ignored him. Impatient, he risked a quiet whistle, which succeeded in getting the horse's attention, at least to the effect that he glanced up at the roof and walked the few feet it took to position himself directly below Alejandro. Smugly confident, Alejandro jumped feet first and might well have landed in the saddle had the black not taken 2 additional forward steps. Determined now, Alejandro leapt to his feet and vaulted over the horse's rump into the saddle. It's time. I'm on your back for keeps, he announced. Laughing triumphantly, he heeled Tornado into motion and galloped through the confusion surrounding the cuartel, pausing only long enough to carve a Z with his blade into the building's adobe wall. Whip in hand, Diego paced back and forth across the mystical symbol devised by the Spanish school, trying to imagine where his short-tempered pupil might have gone. Turning, he was stunned to see Alejandro, costumed in his makeshift Zorro garb, mounted on the black stallion. Alejandro beamed. I not only stole the horse, I left a Z on the wall of the cuartel. You steal a horse and scribble on a wall, and you think you've earned the right to wear that mask? Zorro was not some circus buffoon, some seeker of applause or fame. He was a servant of the people. I'm tired of all your training, your endless lecturing. Tired of waiting for you to tell me I'm ready. I won't give my blessing to a man who looks as though he has been out playing in the dirt. He drew his sword. Draw your blade. Alejandro took a backward step and showed his weapon. Eyes locked, they began to circle one another before engaging blades. Ignoring what Diego had taught him, Alejandro began to slash wildly. Flailing his arms for balance, he stumbled forward, but by the time he'd righted himself, the tip of Diego's sword was poised against his throat. Lesson number 1, Alejandro. Never attack in anger. Montero and Love meandered through the smoldering shambles of the cuartel. How could one lone intruder cause so much destruction? Montero asked. Is he some vaquero turned desperado, then? Love shrugged. Hard to say, what with the mask and all. Mask? Black bandana, poured over his eyes and head. Montero gaped at the zigzag mark that had been slashed into the wall's stucco surfacing. Find the one who did this and see to it that he is hung in the plaza. Unconsciously, Montero rubbed his neck where the personal trio of slashes was concealed by the high collar of his brocaded jacket. And have this letter removed from the wall immediately. Diego cracked the whip, prompting Alejandro to advance, then retreat along a radius line of the design. Upon encountering the next of the bisecting lines, he turned and executed a balestra, a forward hop, followed by a lunge. Nodding in approval, Diego coiled the whip in his hands. You may yet reach the point where people will think of you as a swordsman. Diego took a silver soup spoon and a sheet of parchment from his jacket. This was among the things you pilfered in the plaza. It is an invitation to a banquet Montero is hosting for caballeros from throughout the territory. But I suspect that this is more than some fandango. I think it figures into his designs for Alta California. And it will be your pleasure, Alejandro, to attend as a spy. If I can't pass for Zorro, what makes you think I could pass for a nobleman? Because I plan to endow you with something that is even further from your reach than mastery of the sword. Charm. We must convince Montero and the rest that you are a gentleman of stature, perhaps recently arrived from Spain. If we can succeed in convincing Montero that you're entirely guileless. Guileless? Harmless. A mere dandy. Alejandro's eyes widened with misgiving. I have to play a dandy? If Montero views you as even the slightest threat to his enterprise, he will keep you outside it. If, on the other hand, he feels he has nothing to fear by your participation, or that you might even contribute some celebrity to it, he may just invite you into his circle. His eyes stayed on Alejandro. Then we will know for certain what he plans for the people of California. Reluctantly, Alejandro reached for the soup spoon and turned it about in his hand as if it were something strange and baffling. Diego watched him and shook his head. This, too, could take a good deal of work. Sancho to Alejandro's Quixote, Diego climbed from his donkey to lend his patron a hand in dismounting. Made to look other than the wild Andalusian he was, by way of an ornate saddle and tack that had once belonged to his namesake, Tornado allowed himself to be led away by one of Montero's grooms. The Lion Fountain yard, fronting Montero's opulent hacienda, was filled with a score of equally fine horses, along with fancy carriages and coche, some of which had come from as far away as Branciforte and Yerba Buena. It occurred to Diego that the wealth and power of all of Alta California was represented. Decked out in some of Diego's ageless caballero finery, velvet pantaloons, a red waist sash, and a rich blue velvet jacket, Alejandro appeared to blend well with the crowd. "We'll never get away with it." "We will." Diego brushed the dust from his pupil's jacket and leaned close to him. "A nobleman is nothing more than a man who says one thing while thinking another. Good luck." "Don Alejandro del Castillo y Gracia." Montero himself turned at the announcement. With studied arrogance, Alejandro extended his hand to Diego, who placed in it a land grant document he drew from the pocket of his own jacket. "I have just arrived from Mexico City, by way of Mazatlan and Ensenada, to inspect our family holdings in the north, and it was suggested that I call on you." "And why is that?" "Well, you see, my mother is quite close to Queen Isabel, and I am informed that Alta California in particular remains a land of opportunity for men of vision." Montero stroked his bearded chin. "And you view yourself as a man of vision, Don Alejandro?" "Let us say, a man in search of vision." Montero gestured Elena forward. "May I present my daughter, Elena?" Alejandro gazed into her eyes and lowered his lips to her hand, then executed a simple trick Joaquin had taught him years earlier, and conjured a rose out of nowhere. "For you, fair senorita." Elena accepted it with intrigued amusement and thanked him. Well before 8 in the evening, Montero's gala was already underway, and too many glasses of Montero's snow-chilled imported champagne had loosened Alejandro's tongue and made him more the fool than the dandy he was supposed to be. Diego quietly chastised him. "You're overplaying your part. Rein in your performance before you fall off the stage." Alejandro leaned back foppishly in his chair. "I must say I prefer you as a servant. Yes, servitude brings out your better qualities." Diego moved away as he saw Elena approaching. "Don Alejandro, my father and I would like you to join us at our table." Alejandro stood, teetering slightly, but managing nonetheless to take her arm. "Nothing would delight me more, senorita." At the host's table, much to Montero's own disquiet, polite conversation had turned without warning to the subject of the recent assault on the cuartel. "Believe me," Don Hector was saying, "Zorro is the least of our concerns, even if he is the same man who terrorized this place 20 years ago." When Elena and the young dandy from Castile arrived, Montero stood and introduced him to each of the members of his inner circle. "And this is Captain Harrison Love," he finished. "If not caballero, a man of kindred spirit." Alejandro proffered the Texan a limp hand. "Are you not the same Harrison Love who is said to have recently engaged the bandit of some legendary reputation?" "He's hardly legendary, Don Alejandro." "Is that so? Well, with any luck at all, it won't require as much shot to bring him down as it did the church confessional." Restrained laughter escaped the Dons, and Montero as well, who watched Love's embarrassment turn to jealousy as Alejandro held a chair for Elena. Diego threaded his way through Montero's rambling Casa Mayor. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, merely something he could use to expose Montero's scheme, which in his heart he knew to be nefarious. Turning a corner into a broad hallway softened by plush Persian carpets, he found himself confronted by a sturdy, uniformed guard holding an old flintlock. That someone should be posted so far from the festivities guaranteed the significance of the closed room at the man's back. Holding his tray aloft, Diego continued along the corridor without hesitation. Hastening to a doorway that opened on the adjoining room, he snatched a glass from the tray and threw it to the floor. The guard's ears pricked up, and he hurried into the room. Stepping from the shadows near the fireplace, Diego brought an iron poker down on the guard's head. Relieving him of a ring of keys, Diego quickly and quietly crossed the corridor to the closed door and let himself in. In mounting panic, Alejandro studied his place setting. A bewildering array of cutlery that included half a dozen spoons, almost as many forks, and a couple of oddly shaped knives whose specific purpose he could scarcely imagine. Fortunately, most of the dons were too engaged in separate conversations to notice his dilemma. Alejandro was watching Montero for cutlery clues when he saw him whisper something into the ear of Don Luis. Luis then accepted a key from Montero and left the table. In what was obviously Montero's private study, a richly appointed room with a vaulted ceiling, Diego stared in anguished disbelief at a portrait of Esperanza that hung on the wall behind Montero's desk. From her apparent age, it had to have been executed during the years Diego had spent in Spain. The only other object that drew his interest was a locked iron-banded traveling chest that sat against the outside wall. Moving to it, he tugged at the lock, then stopped when he heard footsteps in the corridor. By the time the imposing oak door opened, Diego had concealed himself behind a large armchair. Montero's chief supporter, Don Luis, entered and moved directly to the chest. Unlocking it, he retrieved a small, lacquered box, then relocked the chest and departed. Alejandro feigned foppish curiosity and asked, "Who exactly is this Zorro person?" "An anarchist who fancied himself a Robin Hood," Don Hector answered. Elena turned to her father. "But why would the people so embrace him if he was nothing more than a bandit? I'm sure there are some who consider him heroic." Alejandro made a gesture of dismissal. "Heroism is but a romantic illusion." "Much like nobility?" "Elena!" Montero reprimanded sharply. Alejandro went on, "I myself have been this close to several notorious bandits." Elena exhaled wearily. "I'm sure they have much to fear from you, Don Alejandro." Harrison Love broke the uneasy silence that descended over the table. "Hey, this is a party, isn't it?" He pushed back his chair, stood, and bowed stiffly at Elena. "May I have the honor of this dance?" Her eyes strayed over the courtyard as Love escorted her to the dancing area. Could one of the men her father had gathered be a traitor to the cause? And really, what cause was that? As near as anyone could tell, the Zorro who had slipped into the cuartel had come to steal a horse. Unless the horse had been his to begin with. It was all too confusing. Suddenly, she noticed Don Alejandro standing behind Love, staring at her with candid interest. All her careful technique was abashed. She turned red. "Have you nothing better to do than stare?" she asked sharply. Love whirled, startled and irritated to see Alejandro, a rival, at least in his eyes. "You looking for something?" Alejandro shrugged. "A miracle in everyday life." Love squared his shoulders. "Yeah? Well, go look for it somewhere else. Elena and I are trying to dance." "You are trying, Captain. Only she is succeeding." Before Love could even respond, he added, "Don Montero wishes to speak with you." Love blinked stupidly, bowed to Elena, and reluctantly moved off, leaving Elena and Alejandro eyeing each other. After a moment, he opened his arms in graceful gesture of invitation, and she accepted. Diego returned from his brief reconnaissance in time to see the conclusion of Alejandro and Elena's flowing, almost sensuous waltz. Alejandro called to the leader of the orchestra. "A jarabe tapatio, if you please." Then he turned to Elena. "Do you feel equal to the task of attempting something more robust?" She tilted her head, then smiled sweetly. My only concern is for your distaste of perspiration, Don Alejandro. She set herself in an almost defiant posture as the dance began. Then Alejandro moved around her like a flamenco dancer, his boot heels tapping accents on the paving stones. All at once, the pompous caballero was a strutting bantam cock, and the transformation roused her. People clapped in time to the beat and cheered the dancers as they would the moves of a matador. Montero and the dons had stopped to see what the commotion was about, and Harrison Love wore a look of bridled vexation. When Alejandro saw Montero hastening toward him, he immediately fell back into character, altering his posture from one of sportive self-confidence to stuffy propriety. Don Montero, excuse me. I must take a moment to catch my breath. Your daughter is a very spirited dancer. Shoving Alejandro aside, Elena hurried from the dance floor. Montero watched her for a moment. I apologize if she offended you. Completely unnecessary. She is young and impulsive, but her beauty is incomparable. It would be my great pleasure to introduce her at court. Montero inclined his head. Elena and I would be honored. Speaking of introductions, young man, if you would care to join us in my private courtyard, there is something I wish to share with you. Why, whatever might that be, Don Montero? A vision of the future. Some members of the inner circle were already seated as Montero positioned himself by a long curtain which promised surprises. Fellow caballeros of Alta California, 2 decades ago, Spain acquiesced to the demands of a group of mestizos and granted independence to Mexico. All of us, however, have fond memories of the golden years when we ruled this territory in the name of the crown. My friends, the time has come to reclaim what was ours. I give you the Republic of California. The curtain dropped away at the pull of a cord, unveiling a canvas map of North America that depicted the new republic. Don Aguirre of Branchiforte looked uncomfortable. Are you proposing revolution? If so, think hard of what happened in Texas. Santa Anna promised autonomy and instead rode north with the black flag of no quarter. Montero waved his hand. Our succession is to be a bloodless one. Revolution and massacres are unnecessary because we are going to buy our independence. Don Peralta spoke with surprising intensity. You talk of buying California? I, for one, find it difficult to believe that El Presidente would part with California for any amount. Montero nodded. I grant you that. But at the moment, Mexico is heavily in debt to both England and Spain, and Santa Anna's coffers are empty. The dons traded glances of incredulity and concern. And with what do you intend to pay him? You must be aware that whatever terms were discussed surely surpass what we could raise, even by pooling all our resources. You're nursing a dream. Montero merely smiled. Very well, but let us all live the dream together. He moved to the table, opened the lacquered box, and held up for everyone's inspection a bar of pure gold, prominently stamped with the Spanish imperial seal. Tomorrow, we will take a trip to the mountains, where I will lay all your doubts to rest. All but Louis recognized the remark as their cue to depart. As the other dons were filing from the courtyard, he lingered a moment by the canvas map. You gave me the land. I mined the gold. Now you tell me that I must forfeit my profits to help you realize a dream? Montero clapped Louis on the back. I haven't forgotten your loyalty, my friend. When I rule California, you shall be at my side. Louis forced a smile. You're too generous. Alejandro was searching for Diego when he all but bumped into Elena in the hacienda's central courtyard. Leaving so soon, Don Alejandro? She said, pretending concern. If only I hadn't promised Captain Love that I would wait for him, I would gladly usher you out. Alejandro gestured dismissively. Do what you must. if you don't trust yourself being close to me." Her eyes widened. "Trust? It's you who are not to be trusted, Don Alejandro. You're quite a chameleon." "I know the benefit of a good disguise, if that's what you mean, senorita." She stared at him for a moment. "Good night, Don Alejandro." He dipped his head. "And to you, senorita." Driven by soldiers from the Los Angeles garrison and led by Montero and Love on horseback, the convoy of coaches had departed the hacienda at sunrise. But now, after a jostling 4-hour ride over rugged terrain, Alejandro sensed that they were finally reaching their destination. The coach doors were opened by one of the soldiers, and Alejandro and the bone-weary dons climbed out into sunshine so bright that it briefly blinded them to the very sight Montero had brought them so far to see. When their eyes adjusted, however, they found themselves looking into a narrow canyon where a mining operation was in full swing all around them. The whole of the complex, from sluices to mine shafts, was being worked by captives in shackles and chains, many of them Indians, woman and child alike, under the command of armed men. Swallowing his fury, Alejandro surveyed the scene, and his attention was drawn to one of the few clothed figures among the slaves. He saw that it was Father Felipe. "Welcome, gentlemen, to El Dorado," Montero announced. He and Love led their astonished guests to a crude stairway that switchbacked down into the canyon. "At first, we were literally picking gold from the river," Montero explained. "But now that we have discovered the mother lode, we're involved in digging and smelting." Alejandro watched with distress as a young boy staggered under the weight of a load of slurry. Exhausted, the boy paused for a moment, only to be severely kicked back into motion by one of the guards. "So this is the future of California," Alejandro said, careful to keep the revulsion from his voice. Montero puffed out his chest. "Exactly. For 20 years, Don Luis and I have kept this operation going without breathing a word to any but our most trusted agents." Montero continued his guided tour, ultimately leading the dons down into one of the mines where a small room had been hewn out of solid rock. One end of the room was partitioned by thick iron bars, behind which were burnished stacks of gold bullion. He picked up one of the ingots. "I've had all the bars marked with the Spanish seal. Now do you understand? Within a week's time we are going to buy California from Santa Ana with gold dug from his own land." Returned to the glare, Montero was leading everyone to the smelter room when a wild scream came from one of the men operating the handcars. Squinting, Alejandro recognized the whooping worker as none other than Three-Fingered Jack himself, though near-starved and plainly loco. "Welcome to Hell's Outhouse, caballeros!" he screamed. "Ignore him," Love said, sneering. "He's a common thief." "Thief, yes. Common, never. Though nothing compared to you, gentlemen. Nothing. You filthy devils, you steal lives." Incensed, Harrison Love calmly stepped to one side, raised his rifle, and shot Jack through the chest. On the ground lay the partner Alejandro had run with for 4 years, the man who had saved his life in Mazatlan and again in San Diego, the friend who was almost like a brother to him. No sooner had Montero moved off towards the coaches than Harrison Love motioned Alejandro to one side. "You and I need to talk. Back at the cuartel, just the two of us." "Not today, Captain. Perhaps some other time." "Today, just the two of us." He reined the horse around and trotted off to join Montero. At Montero's hacienda, Diego had led Tornado to the stable and was so absorbed in grooming the horse that he had begun to sing softly to himself, and thus failed to notice Elena standing nearby, watching him. "Good afternoon. I'm sorry I interrupted your song. Your voice is very soothing." "It was for the horse, senorita. High-spirited creatures need to hear soothing songs." I see. Diego turned away from her and began to comb Tornado more firmly. Elena picked up a brush and began to work alongside him. The care she demonstrated made him think of Esperanza. Almost before he realized it, he said, "You so resemble your mother." "My mother? But how could you possibly know that?" "I mean that you looked nothing like Don Montero, so your beauty must obviously come from your mother." Elena laughed and returned her attention to Tornado's shiny coat. Diego gazed at her. "What became of your mother?" "She died giving birth to me. Father rarely speaks of her. He finds it much too painful." Elena studied him for a long moment. "I have to ask, have we ever met before?" "Why do you ask, senorita?" "I'm not sure. Something about your voice. I'm almost certain I've heard it somewhere." Diego struggled to control his emotions. "You may have heard it, senorita, though how could you have heard it from my lips since I haven't been to Spain since before you were born?" Elena shrugged. "Well, yours is a very pleasant voice nonetheless." He watched her move off, then leaned his forehead against Tornado in tormented misgiving. The coaches didn't return until late afternoon. Alejandro had no sooner stepped down from the carriage than Love beckoned him to follow him to his office in the cuartel. The two of them sat down opposite one another at the captain's desk, a picture of wine between them. Alejandro expected him to pour from the lidless container, but instead he slid it across the desk, giving it a spin with his fingers. The pickled head of Joaquin rotated into view. Alejandro's entire body tensed, at once suppressing shock, nausea, and unbridled rage. "I must say, Captain, that you are a very sick man." "Yeah, I suppose it must strike someone of your breeding as odd. His name was Joaquin Murrieta, and he has a brother who is soon going to meet the same fate. In fact, his name is also Alejandro. Tall man, with a thick mane of black hair and a wild beard. But I don't suppose you've seen anyone who answers to that look." "On the contrary, Captain, I've seen many who answer to that look." Love nodded, almost in a show of respect. "A Murrieta or not, you're less than you pretend to be, bucko." Elena had made a habit of wandering about the daily market in the plaza, where Yangna Indians sold fruit, vegetables, and colorful woven goods. She had noticed an aged native woman watching her, and now the woman was alongside her, pressing a yellow shawl into her hands. A girl translated for the old woman. "She says that it is a gift in honor of your mother. She says that she loved your mother very much." Elena frowned in confusion. "My mother died long ago in Spain." The old woman was making dismissive gestures. With impassioned insistence, she indicated Elena's face. "She says that there is no mistaking the daughter of Diego and Esperanza de la Vega. She says that she was your nursemaid." Elena returned the shawl with a trembling hand. "Please tell her that I cannot accept her gift." The old woman shook her head in refusal and disappeared into the rear of the stall. "It belongs to you now," the girl said. "You must keep it." On the ride to the cave, Alejandro had told Diego of his experiences at the mine and of his more recent encounter with Harrison Love. "Do you think you could retrace the route to the mine?" Alejandro shook his head distractedly. "Montero made sure we couldn't see." "Then you must enter Montero's house tonight and take whatever papers you can carry from the chest in his study." Diego proffered the mask of Zorro, the original mask he had fashioned more than 20 years earlier, and tied it around Alejandro's head. "Thank you for your confidence in me." Diego gave his shoulder a paternal squeeze. "You've earned it." The remains of the de la Vega household stood on a bluff overlooking the ocean. Elena meandered through the ruins, but the blackened walls and woodwork and rickety staircase told her nothing. Pausing at what had obviously been a window that looked out on the rolling water, however, a familiar scent came to her on the offshore breeze, and she realized at once that its origin was a tall, flowering Romania bush directly under the window. Tormented by doubt, a sudden weakness overtook her, and she slumped down on the broken remains of a wall and buried her face in her hands. She wrapped her arms around her knees and inhaled the fragrance, recalling, for no reason she could establish, the melodious voice of Don Alejandro's servant. Side 4. Leaning back from the round table in Montero's private courtyard, Love and Louis puffed contentedly at cigars while the Don himself could barely sit still. "Santa Anna has agreed to meet with us tomorrow at noon," Louis was saying. 10 miles east of Los Angeles, and we're to supply the gold then. "Send word to Santa Anna," Montero told him. "Tell him that we agree to the terms. At noon tomorrow he shall have his gold." Montero waited until Louis was gone, then added, "And I shall have California." The Texan had barely opened his mouth to reply when cries of "Fire! Fire!" issued from the vicinity of the kitchen. Montero hurried to the nearest window and threw open the shutters, hoping to locate the source of danger. On a grassy hillside, in plain view, the zigzagging flames of an enormous Z lit up the night. Perched on top of the hacienda's perimeter wall, Alejandro, in the flowing silk and satin of Zorro, watched a squad of mounted soldiers gallop toward the fires Diego had set on the hillside. Alejandro retraced his steps to the balcony and scrambled down into the courtyard. Stealing down a dimly lit and unoccupied hallway, he chanced upon the study Diego had described. The door was ajar, and the vaulted room was empty. Hung on the wall behind the desk was a large portrait of a woman Alejandro initially took to be Elena, but on closer inspection appeared to be Elena's mother, apparently painted when she was not even 20 years old. He was still marveling at the similarities when voices alerted him to the presence of 2 men in the hallway. Desperate for concealment, he grasped the edge of a hand-hewn ceiling timber and threw his feet over the top so that he ended up face down on the beam. Not seconds later, Love and Montero entered. "Santa Anna is to arrive tomorrow," Montero was saying, "and Zorro is here tonight." "He won't stop us," Love replied confidently. "You have my word." Montero whirled on him. "Of what use is your word to me? What if Santa Anna is made aware of what I've been doing under his nose for the past 20 years? Love shook his head. "You heard Don Louis. He's coming here for the gold. And suppose he should learn at the mine? What's to prevent him from reneging on the transaction and mounting an invasion?" Love mulled it over for a moment. "That's all that's troubling you. Why not just get rid of the evidence? The mine's played out anyway. All we'd have to do is reap the necessary explosives and bury the whole works." Montero scowled. "We can't possibly evacuate hundreds of workers by noon tomorrow." "Then don't move them." Love paused. "Leave no witnesses." Montero seemed to retreat into himself. Consolidating the documents on the desk, he handed everything to Love. "Lock these away in your quarters. I must speak with Elena." "And the mine?" "Do whatever you think is required." Love watched him leave the study. Then he himself exited with determination. Alejandro dropped quietly to the floor. picked up the map that Montero had left on the desk and tucked it into his belt. In the corridor, Love came to a sudden halt and began to leaf through the documents with diligence. The map was missing. It was possible that Montero had taken it with him, but... He whirled and hurried back to the study. Throwing open the door, he found himself face to face with a masked figure. Before he could even register a reaction, the tip of the devil's rapier was pressed hard to his throat. "Do as I say, or your mother will lose a son." Zorro forced him back against the hallway wall, relieved him of his saber, and rushed him into the intersecting hallway. "Your captain is not invulnerable to bullets," he shouted to the guards. "Lay down your weapons and approach." When the men hesitated, Zorro pricked the skin of Love's neck. "Do as he says!" Zorro heard the sound of the flintlock striking the door, then approaching footsteps. "Now, turn and face the windows. Bend over and touch your toes. I know it's difficult, what with your well-fed bellies, but do it anyway." Again, the flesh of Love's neck paid a price for the guard's hesitation. "Do as he says!" Zorro maneuvered Love into a position between the guards. Then, without withdrawing his blade from Love's neck, Zorro kicked with his right leg, then his left, sending the guards head first through the window. But by then, Love himself was in motion. He had thought to take up one of the flintlocks, but with Zorro already giving chase, he grabbed hold of a saber and turned to meet his captor. Their blades met with a piercing ring. At the same moment, Montero, also armed with a sword, appeared from behind the corner. Caught between the two of them, Zorro drew Love's saber from his belt, and with a weapon in each hand, parried the scything blades of Love and Montero as they fell in on him time and again. Zorro knew that he couldn't maintain the defense, and hurled himself backward through the doorway into a darkened room. Love and Montero charged in after him, but as he peered round, Love instantly grasped that they had lost the momentary advantage they had enjoyed. Then all at once, a blade clanged against his saber, nearly knocking it from his hand, and the fight was renewed. Directly in front of Love, someone crashed into a chair and slipped to the floor. He counterattacked with a series of rapid strokes that sent his opponent backwards against the wall, then down to the floor. "So, the legendary fox has met his match," Love said triumphantly. His saber was probing for soft places in the body at his feet when 3 more guards hurried in. A torch in the hand of one of them spilled flickering light across the room, revealing Montero at the end of Love's blade. "You fool! He has escaped." While the swords of Love and Montero clashed in the dark, Alejandro ducked into the adjoining room and quietly closed the door behind him. Recognizing where he was, he hurried to the balcony that overlooked the private courtyard just in time to see Cadet Corporal Lopez and 4 other soldiers from the garrison rush into view below. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, "but I'm going to step out for some air." With a powerful swing, Alejandro propelled himself over the heads of his assailants. Keeping to the shadows of the eastern colonnade, he hurried for the perimeter wall, hoping that Tornado would be waiting for him somewhere on the other side. He saw a ladder leaning against the edge of the tile roof and ran for it, with several soldiers in pursuit. The lead soldier made repeated stabs at him, while Alejandro rapidly scaled the rungs and repelled a second soldier with a kick, even as the first was continuing to flail away at him. Once on the roof, he scampered to the top of the wall and whistled for Tornado. But the horse either didn't hear him or didn't respond. Spurned, Alejandro made tracks for the stable, scurrying along the top of the wall like a tightrope walker. He had his eye on a piebald when the front door abruptly closed. He drew his blade and steeled himself, waiting for his pursuer to show himself. Surprisingly, it was Elena who walked into view, dressed in a robe and wielding a rapier. "Good evening, senorita. We meet again." "Good evening, senor." Once more I warn you to take care. Dangerous men are about." She thrust out her hand. "I want whatever it is you stole from my father." Alejandro laughed. "Oh, come now, senorita. Must we argue?" "Not if you return my father's property." His sidestep prompted her to attack with true intent, and she moved in to engage, feinting adroitly, answering his strokes with expert parries and swift ripostes. Alejandro could tell that the robe was slowing her down, but he was astonished to see her shrug out of it. Shortly, she stood before him in a long, wide-strapped nightgown. "You leave yourself uncovered in more ways than one, senorita." He feinted an attack, only to pass by her and twirl, his blade slicing the nightgown to expose the smooth curve of her left hip. "Well made," she said. He eyed her bare flesh. "Indeed." Closing, she backed him against a bale of hay. When he tried to execute a body-to-body, she caught hold of his rapier with the robe, twisted it from his grasp, and sent it sailing across the stable. Elena grinned and advanced. Trapped, he performed a backward somersault, managing to parry her attack by using his boot heels and the rowels of his spurs. Sparks flew, until at last he succeeded in trapping the blade between his crossed spurs. "Do you surrender?" he asked. "I warn you, senor, I'm still armed with a scream. I sometimes have that effect on women." He leaned to kiss her, and met little resistance. Her moist lips parted, and as they separated, she stared deeply into his dark eyes. He leaned in once more, then, leaping to a ladder and scampering up onto the loft, he was gone. Elena was still catching her breath when her father rushed in, followed by Captain Love. "What happened to you?" "Zorro. I fought him, but he got the better of me." Her father's eyes widened further in shock. "You mean?" "With his sword. Then he left." Montero stood still for a moment, oblivious to the frustration that punctuated her remark. "Was he a man of my age?" "No, father. He was young and vigorous. Very vigorous." Harrison Love swung round and snapped at Corporal Lopez. "Search the woods! Shoot on sight! Even if you're not certain it's Zorro!" Alejandro had made it no further than the underbrush of the near slope of the ravine. He waited until the mounted soldiers had disappeared into the trees before crawling back into the open and whistling for Tornado. "Time to prove that you're something other than handsome," he told the Andalusian. "Let's be off." And Tornado was. Without Alejandro, who made a desperate grab for the saddle, only to be dragged a few meters and deposited in the underbrush once more. Alejandro caught up with Tornado when the stallion stopped just short of the bridge. At the far side of the span waited half a dozen mounted soldiers. With Alejandro firmly in the saddle again, Tornado spun through a full circle and started to race back the way they had come, just as 4 soldiers rode up from the other direction. Alejandro drew his sword as Tornado wheeled again in indecision. 6 to one side, 4 to the other. Which will it be?" Tornado fell back to a skittish canter, then pranced to the railing and leapt into the churning river below. "He did what?" "It's true, Patron. He and the black steed jumped from the bridge. We stood watch for a long while without seeing either of them come to the surface." Montero looked sharply at Love. "And the map?" The Texan shook his head. "Captain, you recall what we spoke of earlier this evening regarding the mining operations?" "I remember." "Then I wish you to go about concealing the evidence as quickly as possible." Alejandro peeled off his wet clothes while Diego studied the sodden map. "Tell me again about the mine." "This is where they have found the mother lode, northeast of the Pueblo, about halfway to San Felicia Canyon." "I know that country." "There are less than 20 guards. Nothing Zorro couldn't overcome." He grinned at Diego. "Or 2 Zorros, for that matter." Diego looked at him. "I won't be going to the mine." "What are you saying?" "There is something else I need to attend to. Something I have waited 20 years to set right." Alejandro gaped at him. "You can't turn your back on them now. Your personal business can wait." "You think that being Zorro was all adventure and daring do?" But I lost everything, Alejandro. My wife murdered before my very eyes. My child stolen and brought up by my most hated enemy. Alejandro's eyes widened in sudden revelation. Are you telling me that Elena? Diego cut him off with a nod. So now you will exact your revenge on Rafael Montero? Diego slapped the map against the palm of his hand. This gives me the leverage I need against Montero. To safeguard his precious dream of an independent California, he will do whatever I ask, rather than risk having this map fall into the hands of Santa Anna. He will tell Elena the truth about her past. And what then? You allow Montero to go through with his plan in full knowledge of what he will do to those slaves when the purchase has been made? My daughter is my life, and I will do whatever it takes to protect her from the bloodbath that will follow Santa Anna's unveiling of Montero's treachery. Alejandro stood his ground insolently. I love your daughter as well, but I cannot put even her life above the lives of so many. He gave Diego one last, bitter look, then turned and strode defiantly out of the cave. Montero and Love had spent the day finalizing the plan to make good on the delivery of the gold. The map is still missing, Montero said, stating the obvious with an eerie calm. What if Zorro should show it to Santa Anna? Love allowed a moment to pass. We'll find him. Perhaps I can save you the trouble. A rapier extended from the darkness of the arcade, its tip pressing into the soft flesh under Montero's chin. Who are you? How did you get in here? I'm on familiar terms with this house, said the male voice. The balconies, the courtyards, your personal study. Answer me. Who are you? The tip of the sword moved to Montero's collar, dragging it down until the fading zigzag scar was revealed. De la Vega, Montero gasped. But even you cannot stop what has been set in motion. Ah, but I'm not here to stop you, Rafael. I've come for Elena. Send for her. I want her to hear the truth from your own lips, or Santa Anna will learn everything. Diego sent the tip of the rapier deeper into Montero's flesh, almost piercing the skin. Montero motioned to Love. Find Elena. Bring her here. Reluctantly, Love backed away, then disappeared into the arcade. Montero held Diego's gaze for a long moment. If I die, the truth dies with me. Diego nodded. I've already given that thought, and I'm prepared to take my chances. Elena's voice rang out from the arcade. Father! She hurried into view, Love one step behind her. Oh, what are you doing here? Lower your sword at once. Diego lifted his chin to Montero. Tell her, Rafael. Tell me what? Tell her who her real father is. Montero seemed on the verge of relenting when he quirked a thin smile. Elena, this man is deranged. His own daughter died long ago, and now he seeks to claim you as his own. Montero looked at him. Your daughter is gone, De la Vega. You must let go of the past. De la Vega? Elena asked in astonishment. Diego lowered the rapier. Vigilant, Love reached for his revolver. Catching sight of it, Elena threw herself in front of Diego. Lower your blade, Montero hissed in warning, or I will have to have you shot, even in the presence of my daughter. Elena glanced to Diego. Please, do as he asks. Diego held her gaze for a moment, and then dropped the sword. Flowers, he said to Elena as the guards were leading him away. Romania. You would execute a man for nursing a delusion? Or is there more truth to Don Diego's words than even you wish to admit, Father? I want the truth. I am your father, and always will be, Montero said harshly. Now, go inside. Elena whirled and hurried, sobbing, into the arcade. Montero and Love arrived at the canyon just before dawn. Touched by the morning rays, a wagon loaded with gold bullion gleamed like a fire set in heaven. "If De La Vega's allies here, he's disguised as someone other than Zorro," Love remarked. Montero nodded, then glanced at his pocket watch. "We have to be underway in an hour if we are to rendezvous with Santa Anna at noon." Leaving Montero with the wagon, Love descended to the canyon floor. Those guards who weren't hastening the transfer with whips and gun butts were elsewhere in the canyon, unspooling fuses that ran from dynamite charges placed in each of the 4 tunnels. Pressing himself against the wall of the tunnel, Zorro edged out onto the scaffolding. Below, several guards were herding scores of captives into the cages that served as their quarters. On the platform stood Montero, who checked his pocket watch and waved a signal to Harrison Love. Love returned the signal from the canyon floor, then spurred his horse toward the place where the 4 fuses were joined in a thick bundle. Zorro calculated that he could only stop Love from lighting it by threatening the arrival of Montero's precious bullion. As he ran from the top of the scaffolding toward the hub of the paddle wheel, hardball rounds from half a dozen muskets buried themselves in the grit at his feet. Montero snatched a rifle from one of his men and added another report to the fusillade. "He's on the wheel! Stop him!" Zorro hauled up the ladder that led to the hub and jammed it into the outsize wheel. The water-driven hoop ground to a sudden halt, leaving the ingot-laden lift car swinging in mid-air. But Zorro knew that he had accomplished little more than a delay. Montero stepped to the edge of the platform, pulled the butt of the rifle hard against his shoulder, and took aim. "It ends here." At that moment, however, something struck the weapon from below, causing his shot to go high. A second blow from out of nowhere sent Montero to the ground. And then he froze as he recognized his assailant. De La Vega. Behind his old foe, Montero saw Elena, a pistol thrust into her waist sash. "Yes, I released him from the cellar. He could have escaped, but he said that he had unfinished business here." Montero tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword and moved forward to engage Diego. "To the death, then." Rapid footfalls on the planking brought Zorro about face in time to see Love rushing toward him, his saber raised for a strike. Slammed back against a support post, he ducked to avoid the deadly thrust. Love twisted in a desperate attempt to regain his balance, but momentum was against him, and he went over the side, tumbling down the slope and crashing into the side of the outbuilding that contained the ore smelter. From somewhere in the building came a squealing sound of a valve wheel being turned, and all at once the steam furnace began to shudder on its mounts. Zorro hurled himself back along the scaffolding, seconds short of an explosion that blew away the front of the building, along with 4 hapless guards positioned nearby. Looking up, Zorro saw Love dashing from what remained of the outbuilding onto the scaffolding 1 level above him. Billowing smoke from below revealed that the base of the scaffolding was in flames. As aged and frail as he sometimes looked, it was clear that Diego was the superior swordsman. His blade moved in ways that Elena's eye could not begin to follow, and it amazed her that Montero was even able to defend himself. Inevitably, the surety of Diego's footwork and the power of his strokes got the best of Montero, and he was disarmed. Diego held him at sword's point, his arm tensed and trembling. "Now, I am at last free to kill you." Elena screamed, the word escaping her as she rushed to Montero's side. "Please, no." But before she realized what had happened, Montero had grabbed her around the neck, tugged the pistol from her belt, and was holding it to her head. In that moment, she knew the truth. "Drop your sword," Montero ordered Diego. He did so without hesitation. Montero shoved Elena aside and leveled the pistol at Diego. An urgent "No!" escaped Elena now, as she lunged, hoping to spoil Montero's aim. She was not entirely in time. Hit in the side, Diego spun and fell to the ground. Zorro backhanded Love with the hilt of his sword and sent him sprawling. But Love retained his hold of his saber and swung it as Zorro moved in. Not at the fox, however, but at the rope that bound the unsupported end of the walkway. Zorro leapt at the last moment, managing a safe landing atop the stalled lift, but losing his sword in the process. Love followed. "This time, by God, I'll have your head." "I doubt very much that God listens to you." Elena dragged herself to her feet. Several meters away, Diego, her real father, and Montero were locked in combat. Below, Zorro and Love had faced off on the dangling elevator, and far below them, flames were racing toward the caged captives. "Elena," Diego shouted to her in the midst of the battle, "you must do what you can to free them." Weakened by loss of blood, it was all Diego could do to hold on to his rapier while Montero repeatedly hacked away at him. Montero moved in to deliver a killing stroke. But instead of Diego, Montero's blade found the harness straps of the bullion wagon. Spooked, the horses reared, then raced off while Diego hauled himself up into the wagon's seat. Montero gazed at the departing wagon, unaware that the severed harness had become entwined around his feet. Encountering a large stone, the wagon bucked, and Montero's legs were suddenly swept out from under him. He pawed the ground, then began to scream as the wagon gathered speed on the downslope, closing on the rim of the canyon. Atop the lift, Zorro evaded each maniacal slash of Love's saber. Then he made a swift, pivoting sweep of his right foot, which made Love lose his grip, and his weapon rolled over the edge. But Zorro rolled as well, and reaching out, succeeded in snatching it in mid-air. Spying Zorro flat on his back with one arm outstretched over the edge of the car, Love strode forward in a crazed, lumbering way, just as Zorro was extending the captured saber in front of him. Impaling himself on his own blade, Love came to a dead stop. His hands gripped around the saber where it pierced him, just below the heart. Then all the breath went out of him, and he collapsed to his knees. Zorro looked up to see the bullion wagon plunging over the rim of the canyon. Letting go of Love's saber and pulling his whip from his belt, he snapped it around a nearby scaffolding beam and swung out into the air a moment before the wagon struck the lift, sending it, Love, and Montero crashing to the canyon floor. Armed with 2 single-shot pistols she had taken from dead guards, Elena finally completed her long descent of the burning scaffolding and saw that fuse flames had been lit and were closing rapidly on the dynamite charges. The prisoners were distraught. She sprinted to the nearest cage and shot the lock open. Men and women streamed through the door, nearly knocking her down in their mad race for cover. Breaking free of the surge, she ran to the second cage and there discharged the other pistol. She looked up to find Zorro standing over her, smiling. "Alejandro?" she asked. "No time to lose," he said, reaching for her hand. They joined the fleeing prisoners in a furious race for safety as the fuses reached their destinations and the entire canyon was enveloped in a deafening storm of rock and dust. With the scaffolding demolished and buried under countless tons of debris, it was a long, hard climb to the canyon rim. Elena kneeled down beside her mortally wounded father, lifted his head, and ladled some water into his mouth. "Is it finished?" he asked weakly. Alejandro nodded grimly. "It is finished." Diego's eyes moved to Elena. "My beautiful daughter, fate plays strange tricks on us. Just when I find you, I lose you again." She shook her head, wetting his face with her tears. "You'll never lose me, Father." Diego placed Elena's hand atop Alejandro's. "People will always need a hero to rally behind, Alejandro. Wear the mask proudly, and when the time comes, bestow it upon one you deem worthy, as I have." His voice trailed off. His breath rattled in his chest, and he died in the arms of his daughter. His own face masked with grief, Alejandro held Elena and cried silently with her. In the solace of each other's arms, their apprehensions diminished, and in that moment, the future seemed assured. Alejandro glanced at the crib to see if his son was still paying attention. The infant stirred under its wrappings and waved one tiny hand in the air as if in distress. "Ah, do not worry, little Joaquin. Wherever great deeds are remembered, your grandfather lives on. For there must always be a Zorro. And someday, when he is needed, we will see him again." Grinning down at his son, Alejandro raised himself to his full height and took up his saber. On his fearsome steed, Tornado, Zorro would scour the countryside for evildoers. He flourished the blade and made a skillful leap onto a nearby chair. Fighting like a lion! Executing a tight spin and a perfect thrust in the direction of the doorway, Alejandro found Elena watching him. She glanced at Joaquin and arched an eyebrow. "This is your idea of putting the baby to sleep?" Sheepishly, Alejandro returned to the crib. Leaning over, he kissed the child on the forehead. "Sweet dreams, my son. And you as well, my beautiful wife." Elena pulled away from his tender kiss to show him a playful smile. "And when I dream, what face shall I give to this dashing rogue, El Zorro?" Alejandro grew serious. "He has been different men, it is true, but he has loved you as each of them." Elena exhaled deeply. "And the one who now wears the mask, do you know where I might find him?" Alejandro grinned. "You know how Zorro is, Querida. He could be anywhere.